I often say I've never lost a briefcase, and I have a whole army of retrievers to prove it. I'm getting rather used to being recorded, but I must tell you that proportional to the amount of total speaking, I've been recorded a higher percentage of the time in Indiana than in any state I've ever been in. And there's two reasons for that, both previous to this trip. I spent 4 weeks once at Bloomington at the university on a workshop, all of which was recorded. And at the conclusion of this workshop, I came to Purdue for 2 days, and it was recorded. Not only recorded, but I spent the 2 days in a completely electronic workshop. That is to say, if you've ever been in Dr. Steer's clinic, you know that you're practically an electronic instrument from the time you come in, the time you leave. I think the topic today is an exciting one, and I shall try to convey some sense of this excitement to you. I'm going to begin, though, in a very modest fashion and simply say that the whole field of research relative to language or exceptional children or educational process relative to features that we expect children to learn or want them to learn is a field of study that we're just beginning to sense the instrumentality and the complexity of. Now that's an honest statement, but not a very good grammatical one. I think there was a time when we felt that you could take children apart, children who have problems that we don't ordinarily encounter, whether this be a clinical apartness or a special class apartness. And if we could get these children in that kind of a separate environment, that this alone would have a great deal of value. I think we've come to believe that this isn't necessarily so, that the special class children weren't learning anymore after a few years of special class development than they seem to learn in a regular class. At least that is the data. And I'm not sure that our clinical environments, even though we have great opportunity to set them up in the way we think they're best set up, are necessarily optimal environments for clinical purposes. At least I sense a great deal of change in the fields of psychotherapy, the fields of clinical psychology, social work, and so forth. And I, at first hand, feel that this applies to speech pathology. We have much to learn before we can set up an appropriate process of learning that fits the particular goals that we are able to set for these children. Just to show that a child has a deficit and that we have an opportunity to work at that deficit isn't necessarily going to result in any quick functional change. I've come to believe that there has to be a field of overlap from research to education, or research to clinic, or if you will, from clinic to research and from classroom to research. And we've got to bring to bear upon this rather complex task the best minds and the best methods and the best resources at our disposal. It's no longer sufficient to feel that there is research and then there is education, or there's research and there's clinic. And if you will, I'm going to center upon research and clinic, and you apply it to your own context. My entree into this problem is somewhat, perhaps, personal and maybe a bit novel. This morning I confessed that after some period of waiting and planning and project writing, grant writing, I eventually became part of a group of research people at Parsons State Hospital. This started in about 1958-59. And what I did, since I was listed as the director and the person who recruited the staff, I sought as a pivotal person a strong research talent or a strong research specialist, because I reasoned that if we were going to invade the environment of a state hospital, we had to face the realism of both our planned undertaking and the environment in which this was going to be set up. And I sensed that it was a very demanding job. Fortunately, I was able to get a young man to come in to be the field director of this project, who had taken a degree at the University of Indiana in what was then called clinical research. He was a major in clinical research psychology. That was the title. However, he had just spent 6 years in doing Air Force research and was kind of sick of the way the Air Force treated their researchers, breaking up the laboratories with impunity and moving people about. It was possible to get him to come to head up this new project. He was experienced, marvelously resourceful, with a good sense of humor, and somehow a kind of validity about him, the ability to sense and to attack important problems. Along with him, we employed a brand new PhD with a background in both clinical psychology and what you might call research psychology. He'd taken his degree actually in experimental. We were able to hire a speech pathologist who had had a good deal of formal training with instrumentation and the hardware features of our field, and an educational psychologist who had previously been a teacher of exceptional children. Now, this looked like a pretty promising lineup, and indeed it was. I've come to realize how improbable perhaps it was to assemble that group of people. But because they were somewhat self-conscious and not terribly experienced in the environment in which they were placed for this project, a state school for retarded children, and because this school was 125 miles from the university, they were rather careful in launching into their work. They set up laboratories, first of all, what you might call language, psychological arranged laboratories with timers and racks and printout counters and the various sorts of things that you would see in a university laboratory. And they proceeded to do some research. And I must say, in my opinion, it was good research. It was innovative, it was exciting. They very carefully chalked the responses that they wanted to get. They attacked problems that required both the experimental know-how and the practical understanding that the group had. And some of this work was published. Some of you may have seen it. Part of it was put into a monograph that came out in 1963 as monograph supplement 10 in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Disorders. This work was done between a period from probably the summer of 1958 to the spring of 1960, in about a 2-year period, although it didn't get into print until January 63, or at the end of 62. Now, what I want to talk about, however, is not that work, but what has happened since. The group felt at that time that in order to call it research, it had to be pretty much laboratory-oriented. It had to go on in a place where they could get everything set up in pretty much of an optimal fashion. That was the criteria, that was the definition of research that this group used. Well, now not more than 10 or 15% of the research at Parsons State Hospital is confined within those laboratories. We have, it's true, achieved some rather explicit arrangements in other portions or locations of the hospital But most of it is done in cottages, classrooms, recreation units, playgrounds, you name it. Outdoors and indoors. And why has that happened? And why am I bringing it in as an entree to our discussion about research? Well, it happened because of the location, for one thing. You see, it's impossible for an experimental researcher who becomes a part of an environment, gets to meet people over coffee, talks with them in the evening, a little kind of journal seminar that they arrange, goes over and visits their clinic, and so on. What happens is they get interested together. Now, the first big breakthrough on this was what we called our first experimental cottage. And really it isn't our main experimental cottage now, but it was our first one. And what kind of an experimental cottage was it? Well, first of all, it was the cottage at Parsons State Hospital with the lowest functioning children, what many people call the diapered kids, the kids living on the cement floor without playthings and without implementing educational tools or equipment. The kids for whom the aides turned the desk around to the wall from. Why did we tackle that? Well, because it, first of all, was a cottage that was of some concern to some of the staff. And it was a cottage that one of our research people, who was added about that time, thought would be a good experimental group because he wanted to replicate some of the work that he had formerly done at Yerkes Laboratory and at University of Wisconsin with chimps and other members of the monkey family. And he did some of this work, which was duly published and of interest to some people, particularly in the field of comparative psychology. But the thing that turned everybody on was the fact that they found out that if they really stayed with these children in terms of an educational program, there was a lot they could teach them. They taught them to eat. They taught them to go to the bathroom. They taught them to wear clothes. They taught them to sit in little groups and play. They taught them playground behavior outdoors in a playground that was constructed specifically for them. And they even taught some of them enough social behavior that parents could take them out to dinner. And they got a lot of this on film. And it really created a lot of excitement within the hospital and the setting. Now, this was done by combining or a combination of research and institution personnel. One of the key participants was a very instrumental, creative Negro lady who was an aide on the cottage. She's the one that did most of the doll playing and the group social arranging. The young man who started out to study these kids in comparison, bent wire and tangible and social reinforcement studies to replicate what he'd previously done with chimps, wound up creating a kind of a special little environment where he could study what he calls social response behavior. And he found that every child, no matter how limited he was, had some kind of social behavior that could be used as an initial operant level. I use that term perhaps simply because it's our jargon. But it simply means that there is something to begin with, something to reinforce, something to shape, something to influence. You're not beginning at a zero level, even with these children. But you have to set up an explicit arrangement to study what their repertoire is. Because just in scooting about a cement floor in a big open cottage with most of the people avoiding the children, you don't know what they do have. It's that you know what they have is not very instrumental in some kind of formal program. Well, anyway, this was sort of the thing which set everybody off. Now we have other arrangements, some of them ongoing, some of them have been 2 years in the making. This is what we have come to. Let me, in a few words, try to explain it. There's a vast amount of formal experimental data, both in its raw, unanalyzed form and in theoretical form, which has been derived through laboratory basic experimentation, which is applicable to educational, psychological, sociological, what have you, environments where we work with children. And it takes some courage and some tough-mindedness and some faith on the part of people to apply and refine and modify and combine these principles in the rather difficult job of human engineering that we call education and clinical training. And this is a field that is virtually untapped. We don't know how valuable some of these animal-derived and laboratory-derived principles are until we put them in some kind of an appropriate arrangement with human subjects and try them out over a period of time. The whole bevy of principles that we sometimes now refer to as behavioral or operant were largely derived from animal experimentation. And I know I had professional friends who felt that they had little application to human environments, human subjects, particularly in the fields of complex behavior such as language. And some of them told me in very dramatic form and fashion why this was so. But I think what they didn't understand is that these principles and these experimental data were primitive. They were in their beginning phase, and there had been little effort to apply them and refine them and modify them to see what their power would be in arrangements that involved human children. And once you begin to do this, it's rather important that you observe the effect of what you're doing, because you can determine on the basis of such application studies what the power of a principle is, and particularly how it might be increased and refined in its potency by the experimental work that you're doing with it. And as a consequence of this work, it's virtually a new principle, or it would be viewed in a new light. And that it is just as important from the standpoint of scientific value then in a couple of years to look at this principle in light of this new data. And the person who derives this new data has just as much credit as a scientist in his own right, if what he does is demonstrable as being instrumental or valuable. In other words, you don't hide behind some kind of rationalization. You simply say, will it? Or can I? Or does it? And so you look at the record. Did the behavior modify? Did the child acquire new skills? Did he adjust better to the environment of the classroom as a consequence? And so you're putting yourself on the record. Now, if I could generalize hopelessly beyond what is perhaps the immediate context of my remarks, I would simply say that it's an effort to apply to clinical and educational environments something of the same kind of purposefulness that the people attempted to apply to the physiological laboratories and the physical science laboratories a couple of centuries ago under the heading of the scientific method. You can't do research now, we say, without the scientific method, and we say, if you attempt to do research without the scientific method, what method do you use? Well, I could almost at this stage say the same thing. If you are a teacher or a clinician and you don't have an approach or a method, what do you use? Some kind of intuitive, personalized validation? What do you use? We've come to call this application, the broad group of principles that we have come more and more to involve ourselves with, we've come to call this functional analysis of behavior. Well, that's a rather important term to think about for a minute. Functional analysis. Meaning, what is it that influences the child to behave the way he does? What are the controlling variables? If you can functionally analyze and determine what these are, then you can engage in some kind of intervention to modify, alter the conditions, and as a consequence, alter the child's behavior. Now, you have to, if you're going to give a great deal of enthusiasm to this process, you have to believe that the behavior, the explicit behavior that you are able to view and to influence in this fashion is indeed valuable. At lunch I was telling a small group something about this in one context. I used the illustration of the child in the classroom who is a poor speller, and by a careful analysis of his behavior found to engage very infrequently in the study of spelling words. He manages somehow to avoid doing this by a rather resourceful set of intricate procedures. Now, if you believe that the amount of time spent in perusing those words and that list and engaging in some kind of study behavior is important, then it should be important for you to find the controlling features that will increase the amount of time he spends doing that. He's not going to learn it unless he develops that behavior. Now, he may not learn it even if he does, you say. Okay, but then perhaps beyond getting him to engage in study behavior as such, there might be the tactic of better study or different tactics for study. But first of all, maybe you're interested in just getting him to log more study time. So you have to analyze what takes place between the teacher and the child, between the child and his siblings and so forth. And maybe you have to set up some kind of an initial application premise and say, okay, let's try this. Well, after some few hundred hours of trying this and that, I think we seem to find that there's a rather simple basic principle that applies. It's a principle of reinforcement. If you take the child at some moment where he is doing the kind of behavior that you want, you say, fine. In some fashion or other, functional to this child, you reinforce it. That seems like a rather simple and easy thing to do. But also from the hundreds of hours of classroom observation, we find that the busy slum teacher, the teacher in the slum classroom, seldom does that. What does she do? Well, she more likely catches him at a moment of extreme digression? Indiscretion. And she clobbers him in some fashion or other. She gives him a very forceful, don't do that. And then he is pretty much on his own until he repeats some equally unseemly piece of behavior, and then he is given it again. And that happens to be the primary modus operandi used for the whole class. But some of the kids have developed more unstudy-like behavior than others, and they are likely to get it more often. So you have children in this classroom that are behaving in very active fashions as disruptive influences, and you have other kids that are behaving in a very inactive fashion as a non-studying, dawdling, but very poor learning kind of arrangement. And those are your two basic extremes if you study the slum child in aggregate in a classroom. Let's say like a fourth grade classroom. So you give, after some analysis and some thinking with the teacher, you give her a purposeful approach to child X, which is to praise him or to reward him for study behavior. And this goes along, and you have an accumulative record, and you see that the percentage of time is going up and the number of correct spelling words per lesson is increasing. And then you say, all right, go back now and punish him again for times when he isn't studying, and forget the other for a while. So it drops back to the former level. And then you bring it up again. Now it doesn't take, I should think, more than 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of these cycles for you to get a pretty good notion that there's instrumentality in the one method and a lack of functional value in the other one. Well, it just so happens that carrying on this notion of the application, then this is a very simple principle of reinforcement. You'll find it in almost any psychological text, even beginning text, and you'll find it in most any book, let's say, that deals with learning. It's just that it doesn't have very much impact or doesn't seem to have much relevancy until you get a Negro teacher in a slum showing that she can increase the amount of time a child studies spelling words by as much as 75% in 3 days. Then it begins to look like something. Well, let's take another illustration. We have what we call a remedial classroom. It's located in the basement of the Pleasant Green Baptist Church, which isn't much of a basement. It's a pretty crummy looking basement. It's in the old church. It's not in the new addition that they built that has a bowling alley. It's in the old church. And you've seen the basements of old churches. I mean, they have broken windows. They have the John. You wouldn't go in if you could avoid it, and all the rest. But this is a kind of environment that these kids know and feel quite at home in. Furthermore, it has what we think of as very few stimulus control properties, which we assume that a classroom has after a half a dozen years of rather abject failure. So they come over there, and it's kind of like away from everything, and they come bounding down and sit at a little desk with sort of a little cubicle arrangement, and you pay them to come and study. Now, I know that has a jarring effect, but that's the way it began. We paid them, I think, a magnificent sum of 29 cents per study session, which started out to be 2 hours one late June morning, 10 till 12. And initially there were 8 of them, and they grew to a total of 16 by the end of the summer. And so they started coming earlier, and they gradually expanded the period of study, which was proportional in terms of the pay, you see, to 4 hours. They were coming at 8 instead of 10. They were studying from 8 to 12. So we began to diversify the, let's say, the incentives for the little guys to include points of designating 4 kinds of token value points, much like you'd keep a little book of S&H green stamps if you're a housewife and go to the grocery store. One kind of point, well, a little square actually, could be money. Another could be points toward purchases that they could have in the little commissary that we built in a room off the main basement area. It involves simple things like, comic books, candy, trinkets, little items of clothing, so forth. A third type of reinforcer that they had colored little stamp type tokens for were credits toward a major purchase that they could undertake at a later time, like a watch or a second-hand bicycle or something like that. And a fourth one was experience units, like ball game or outdoor movie or things of this kind. Going to a museum, going to a movie downtown, various things that they had indicated a desire for. These they could earn tokens and points to get. So we had various ways that they could earn these points. One of them was to get there promptly, on time. They could earn points for the percentage of time they actually spent at the seat in comparison to wandering around the room. The number of assignments completed got points. And these were, of course, graded on the spot within a matter of 3 to 5 minutes after they had completed the assignment, so that they could put the token immediately in their little book, you see. They didn't have to wait for 3 weeks, the way a freshman composition class sometimes waits to find out what they made on it. And they got points for grade improvement in classroom and other ways they could earn points. These were ways that we thought would actually be indicators of improvement in their academic behavior. So what do you think happens? Comes school in the fall, and they don't want to quit. They like their little club. They like the place they're coming. They like what they're getting out of it. And so it's converted into an after-school program that starts immediately after their regular school is finished in the afternoon and goes till 6 o'clock. And the average child is over there within 3 to 5 minutes after the bell rings, terminating his formal schooling for the afternoon. The attendance for both the summer and the fall run as high as 90 to 97% for different weeks and months. One child whose parent moved on west and who then started going to a school 8 blocks farther away still wanted to be included and managed to get there with a bonus of allotted time of 10 minutes. And still getting his bonus points, you see, for prompt attendance. The average grade for the children in the school for this first group was more than 1 grade level. That is to say, it moved from D's and F's to basically B's and C's. And their achievement scores were significantly up. Now, in attempting to analyze this, one can read into it an awful lot of what you call research principles. First of all, I would say it's a kind of beginning on what I call a technology for incentive environments. It's also a good beginning on what you might call a concept of out-of-school remedial teaching. It could also be thought of as a miniature culture in which you order some of the principles or some of the functions in ways to increase the kind of behavior you want and to reduce the behavior you do not want. Now, within this environment, a good deal of experimentation was carried on. For instance, with a given child, this kind of an experiment would be conducted. 1 week they would double the incentives for, let's say, arithmetic. and his arithmetic study behavior would be cataloged in a cumulative record. And this would be compared to his reading study behavior, which, let's say, got half as many incentive units as before, to see what the potency, let's say, of the incentive system was. They also varied such things as the immediacy of the reinforcer. What effect did it have if the reinforcer was given, but given at a later time? What effect the combining of social praise and these continuing tangible reinforcers, so on and on. You see, you could introduce into this kind of an environment a lot of sub-experiments. So you could see what extinguished the improvement in the behavior and what brought it up again, and what kind of arrangements accelerated it more rapidly. In other words, it's a form of experimentation within a learning environment. Now, except for the fact that the people who conducted this work used some aides who were, in one instance, a Job Corps Negro girl, about 17, at another instant, a young Negro housewife of about 24, and in another instant, a paid graduate student. Outside of those three helpers, the only people they had was a full-time teaching, what you might call research assistant, and the research associate who actually lived in Lawrence and commuted over a couple of times a week to continue to advise and to observe and to collect data. But on the spot, there were 4 people. Now that was the manpower, and I must admit that that's more than you have in a typical classroom. And the 18 children that we were manipulating, 16 in one instance and 18 in a later study, that's fewer than you have in a regular classroom. And I don't mean to say that you can replicate all of this in a regular classroom. But what we're attempting to determine now is what can you put into a regular classroom, both in terms of a maintaining program for these kids and, of course, an effort to make the regular classroom more of a remedial type program. I think there are 2 or 3 things that we encounter when we begin to analyze it in its practical light. For one thing, a regular classroom has already built up for these kids a lot of discordant stimulus control functions. You must realize that many of these kids basically have learned to dislike books, teachers, and many of the paraphernalia that exist within a formal environment. Why? Because there has been so much aversive experience. A kid that's gotten D's and F's for 6 years is a child that's piled up an awful lot of history. It may be better, therefore, to get him into another environment, an arrangement where you can apply in a purer form some incentives, build up a history of success and pleasure, and achieve some relative level of enjoyment and a sense of comfort and success. It's pleasant then, you see, to bring back a report card and give it to the bright young man that has become your companion in this new environment and show him that you got 2 C's this month and get the reinforcer for that very fact. Then grades began to take on more the semblance of the reinforcement system that it provides for upper middle class children. Now, I'm not saying that the incentive system built into formal education is all bad or is all that inadequate. I simply say that it probably doesn't work adequately for a child who is 3 years behind in his achievement index and who has never gotten anything but low grades. and who has at home very little real encouragement for academic achievement anyway. Then I think you need to say, all right, experimentally, what are the controlling variables that I need to look at to set up an adequate incentive system, an adequate program of experience? I believe that we have enough behavioral information and enough of a technology to enable most resourceful people to attack this problem. But I didn't used to look at it that way. I must confess that I used to feel that there was a huge gap between the clinic as I knew it and the psychological laboratories as I knew them. I think this gap has begun to break down. Some of the best people that I know of are doing these application studies, even though they have published a great deal of work from formal experimental environments. Now, I think what needs to be to accelerate this process more is for people from educational backgrounds and clinical backgrounds to begin to evince more interest in the scientific analysis of behavior. You need to become proficient in the application of principles, and then you can bring to these applications enough insight to make them more powerful and more resourcefully arranged. Now, please don't feel that I think that operant conditioning is the answer to all of our prayers. I don't think that at all. As a matter of fact, I haven't used this term very much today, and there's been a purpose for not using it. I think that Skinner, just as other good psychologists, came up with some interesting and valuable principles, more or less validated. At least the students he had at the time helped him carry out validation to a certain degree. But most of the things that you'll read in his writings are simply prospects rather than final issues. And I would put a number of other good psychologists into the picture and simply say this provides a starting point, a reservoir, if you will, of principles to be applied. And I find over and over again, a good clinician will say, after carrying out, let's say, a dissertation study or an experimental study as a colleague of a laboratory scientist, simply say, this is basically what we've been doing all along, only we didn't formalize it. We had no way to check it out. We had no way to refine it. And I think that's literally what is needed in education and in the clinical environments. I spent a little time at CEC, as many of you did, I suppose. I was only able to attend on Monday, and I attended because I'm on a little panel called Task Force 2, which is a group set up more or less under the auspices of the U.S. Office of Education to develop some guidelines in what they call learning disability. And this is an area that all of us more or less relate to, because any kind of an exceptional child has some disability, or he wouldn't be regarded as different. And we've wrestled with definitions, and they've swirled around the concept of brain injury and minimal brain dysfunction and all sorts of explanations of an etiological nature. And I've attempted to analyze these and to kind of squeeze them down to some point where they have functional significance so that you can actually use them as a starting point for some kind of a program of teaching or clinical training. And they leave me totally unsatisfied. I see the effort to deal with such concepts as simply an effort to refine the process of etiological classification. Because even if we find that the child does indeed have X kind of syndrome or Y kind of impairment, you still have got the job as a clinician or teacher of taking this child's behavior and moving it up, adding new units to it, developing new kind of functional skills. And this exists for you whether he is a diagnosed impaired or only functionally impaired child. You can say it's caused by this or that or something else, but you still have got the essential process before you. So I would just pretty much, for my own research purposes, say a child with a learning disability or a child with X disability is a child who does not function in the manner which the best informed people feel that he should. And these best informed people can be housewives or atomic scientists, as far as I'm concerned. But if there is a consensus opinion that he's doing poorly, and that he should indeed be doing much better, then I assume that he has, quotes, a learning disability. And we've got to apply some more powerful tactics, somehow, to accelerate the learning. And perhaps the most important data we get is the progress record, based upon the applications of known approaches, which we keep trying to improve until we find something that works better. Now that is kind of the experimental demand upon us. Well, if we accept that challenge in education or in clinical speech, we've got to have more powerful tools. Because we can't just continue to say he is an impossible child, a child who cannot learn, or some such rationalization as that. We've got to put ourselves in the direct confrontation of this problem and say we're part of the arrangement. We are part of the functions that have got to be analyzed. And what we do have as much relevance to the outcome as what we assume he cannot do. In other words, that is the part of the arrangement that we can manage and manipulate, is our own behavior. We can change the contingencies, the rates, the topography of our responses to this child. We can bring in new dimensions to heighten his incentives. We can build new arrangements with different stimulus properties. We can maintain the fight for longer periods of time functionally than we had thought in some instances we could or should. We can do many things. But it seems to me it's somewhat sterile to continue to look for the needle in the haystack as an explanation of why X child has not learned arithmetic or learned to read. Now, it may be that when we've refined our neurological instrumentation with atomic power and gotten the computer harnessed to the full responsibility of its task and feed in several thousand cues in place of dozens, we'll find some neurological and atomic principles. And I don't mean atomic, I mean physical principles that will take us off the hook. But I don't know that we should take ourselves off the hook. I would say instead of doing that, let's put ourselves on it. Let's put our own behavior into the arrangement. And if we have to put ourselves before a one-way vision mirror or a visual recorder, or put ourselves on microwave to the next campus, or what we need to do, let's find out how, as an instrument in the clinical arrangement, we can be more powerful. Now that kind of exposure is a little jarring, but I guess in my own experience I found exposure to be a rather important kind of tactic. Most of what I am reinforced for these days, and I must admit some of the reinforcement is probably inappropriate, but most of my reinforcers in 1967 are in dimensions that I've felt tremendously insecure and inadequate for in 1957. As a matter of fact, I went far beyond my training, as I have sometimes in rather earthy ways described my exposure anatomically. I found no other way but to step out of my comfortable little niche and my proven little inadequacies and to say, all right, we don't know how to teach speech to a retarded child in any kind of a functionally adequate way. And let's see if we can develop a methodology. And let's go into the slum and see if we can teach reading to children that I had personally known never to have had a remedial reading teacher or even a special teacher. Let's invade these kinds of deficit areas and say, all right, does Professor X have any principles that have value? And how do you know until you expose them and try them out? And somehow it's a better principle after it's been exposed. It's either modified, validated, or discarded. And in any of those instances, it's better for it. Maybe I should stop there. But if there's time, we could continue to talk.
One of the things that, and I should open it up to questions, if you're greedy, I like to get mine in first. This morning you mentioned about the use of, or putting retarded children into rooms and in a special class setting, and that maybe we're expecting a great deal of adjustment from them at this point. And this leads to what some of the people do in speech therapy too, an environment which is another adjustment.
You might call it artificial.
Yeah. And since this tends to cross both of the areas here, I wondered if you could talk to that for just a few minutes, and let others questions.
Well, it would take two principles, one of which seems to apply to the big size and one which applies to the special class. You say about the retarded child, it doesn't generalize well. That is to say, it doesn't generalize behavior from a context to another one. And we say about a child with a speech or language problem that he doesn't have good carryover. I think in either case, it's simply that there is a dimension of experience with some very powerful functional issues filled in that is different about his home environment or community-based environment. It's not the same environment. It affects him differently than the environment you set up. Well, what you eventually want him to do is to make it in that natural environment. That's what you really try to do. Well, how do you help him make the grade? Well, I have a couple of suggestions on this, but I would simply, in the name, suggest that it's a challenging to work at. One of the ways you can help a special class child to adjust to a functional environment is to give him, some kind of vocational or social training, and then follow him into that environment to continue to monitor and instruct. One of the things that you might do, and this certainly involves both the special class teacher and the speech class, is to find out what kind of functional vocabulary you need to have this child, and what kind of functional skills. Are they primarily listening skills, or are they primarily instruction giving skills? Now you can say that basically there are two skills. Is the ability to listen and understand messages and carry out the supposed instructions. And the other skill is to give instructions to somebody coherently so that they'll know what he wants them to do. Now, these are neither of them aesthetic skills, they're functional skills. Does he have enough under certain, well, let's say, realistic circumstances to get the job done. Well, if he doesn't, you've got to improve upon his listening and his explicit speech, communication, behavior. But at least you kind of know how near he comes to fulfilling these critical functions after you've observed him in an environment different from your special class in the country. Now, if you look just for a little while at the child with a speech or language problem in a speech class, what you literally want him to have is skill, let's say, in using the tool, speech and language, probably in learning and in social arrangement. Your best ally, it seems to me, is actually head for the learning would be the teacher, and for the social would be the home, or some combination of teacher and home. And it doesn't do much good for you to say, well, he never has this trouble, and I'm with him. It's better for you to know how he does function. And maybe what you need to do is set up kind of a creative unit for which you're going to have to do some instruction with the adults. Now you mustn't assume that that's out of order. That is a very demanding thing. But we have had some rather startling experiences and the management of a few kind of intrepid people, say, in the last year and a half. For instance, Dr. Ogden Lindsley brings the classes of parents in for even an instruction in behavior management, behavior analysis and behavior management. What parents? For parents that have expressed concern about the problem behavior of their own child. What kind of problem behavior? Well, they wet the bed, they won't eat, continual pressure, the law, the delinquent. Some rather major effect. And so he just issues a challenge. Yes, I will tell you that you will come from school. First order of the day is to learn to make a explicit record of what your child does. Let's don't theorize, but put it in Freudian terms, terms that could be used by your average. Let's just look at what he does.